Welcome to Chapter 37, Public Goods. In the beginning of Chapter 37, Varian talks about certain attributes of goods that we've implicitly assumed but haven't really talked about explicitly. The first one is rivalness. And the question of rivalness is whether if one consumer consumes a good, does it diminish or completely deplete the good for the consumption of any other person? Now, I would submit that goods such as food are quite obviously rival. If I consume an apple, that means that you can't consume the same apple. Congestibility would be an example of rivalness that isn't complete, but at least partial. So, for instance, if a number of people drive on the same road, the addition of another driver causes congestion. And so the experience or the utility of driving on this road is somewhat diminished by having an additional person driving. Excludability is the ability to keep people who have not paid for the good from consuming it. And excludability is technology dependent. I'll give a few examples of this in the next slide, but suffice it to say we have at the bottom, right next to me, this matrix showing the intersection of excludability and rivalness and different categories or types of goods. Private goods, the goods that we've talked about so far in this semester, are goods that are both rival and excludable. And pure public goods would be goods that are non-rival and non-excludable. And the off-diagonal elements, commons goods and club goods, might be better to illustrate with examples, which I will on the next slide. So, possible examples. Private goods, you recall, are goods that are rival and excludable. So, meaning once someone consumes it, it's gone, and it's possible to keep people who don't pay for the good from consuming it. So, food are classic examples of this. So, some of my favorite commodities, gut packs, lattes, and gasoline are prime examples of private goods. On the bottom diagonal, public goods, those that are non-rival and non-excludable, these would be examples of goods that when one person consumes it, it doesn't in any way diminish the good for other people who might also consume it. And there's no way to keep people who didn't pay for the provision of the good from consuming it. When the topic of public goods first came up in the scholarly economics literature, a classic article written by Paul Samuelson, Samuelson proposed lighthouses as an example of a pure public good. So if think about old-fashioned lighthouses, when one ship sees the signal from a lighthouse, that in no way diminishes other ships from seeing the same signal. And once the signal has been provided, it's there for all people or all ships to consume and use the good, whether they paid for it or not. I would argue that classic over-the-air radio stations on the AM and FM band are also examples of public goods. The fact that I listen to a particular radio station in no way diminishes it for you or any other person to listen to the same station. And once the signal has been sent, there's no way to exclude people who don't pay for it or patronize the sponsors who paid for the sending of the signal. National defense would also be an example of a public good in the same way. I mentioned in the previous slide that excludability is technology dependent. So consider club goods for a moment. So bottom row on the left-hand column, XM radio would be a classic example of a club good. So the fact that I listen to 80s on 8 on XM radio doesn't in any way diminish the signal if you also want to enjoy the classic music from the 1980s, but XM radio has the ability to exclude both you and I from listening to it unless we pay our subscription fee. The technology that allowed this to happen only recently came into existence. Toll roads would be another example of this. Roads through rural areas might not be thought of as excludable, but with toll tags that you put in your windshield, the cost of excluding people or making people pay who consume the good has become technologically feasible. Maybe a more 80s or 90s example of a club good sometimes is thought of as a fitness club. So if you have a fitness club where the membership is well below the capacity, adding one more person to the club at an off hour doesn't really affect congestion, but it is possible to keep people who didn't pay for the club from using the equipment. And then in the upper right-hand corner, commons goods. Commons goods are congestible, meaning that if additional people consume it, it diminishes the usefulness for all the people who are consuming the good. But it's not possible to exclude people who didn't pay for the good. So rural highways would be an example of a commons good. So I'm thinking of roads that have very little traffic. They're way out in the middle of nowhere. There aren't enough people who drive them to warrant spending the money to put up toll booths. But if enough people drive on it, then it does become congested and the usefulness of the road becomes at least somewhat diminished. The classic commons good would be that of clean air and water. And we talked about this in the previous chapter when we addressed the tragedy of the commons. The tragedy of the commons in the original classic article by Garrett Hardin was applied to environmental cleanliness, right? So if people put pollution out into the atmosphere, that in essence diminishes the usefulness of clean air, right? But it's not possible to exclude people, right? No one technically owns the air. Police protection also would be an example of a commons good. So if we think about the provision of public goods, we're going to think first about examples of what we would call a discrete public good. So a discrete public good would be a very simple good where either you have it or you don't. So we don't talk about quantities of the public good. So we're thinking about where the two possible levels of output for this public good are 1 or 0. So a classic example of it, thinking back to my freshman dorm room at the University of Denver, suppose that Mr. Kim, my freshman roommate, and I were considering buying a TV for our dorm room. Buying a TV for our dorm room would be a Pareto improvement if my reservation price plus Kim's reservation price is greater than or equal to the cost of providing a TV. So just by way of review, I know we very recently did this in chapter 35, but remember how it was that we came up with this idea of a reservation price. My reservation price would be the price that makes me indifferent between having a TV or not. So on the left, the first line, consider my level of utility if we don't have a TV, but I have all my money available to spend on other goods. That level of utility must by construction be equal to my level of utility if we have a TV, but I contributed my maximum possible dollar or my reservation price to it. So then the amount of money that I have left over to spend on other goods would be my budget, M sub j, minus my reservation price, R sub j. So this sort of statement implicitly defines my reservation price, and it also implicitly defines Kim's reservation price. Now, suppose that it really is a Pareto improvement for Kim and I to have a TV in our room. So the sum of our reservation prices is greater than or equal to the cost of providing or a cost of purchasing a TV. Then the question is, how should the cost of this TV be split between Mr. Kim and me? Should the cost be split in half since there's just two of us? Well, despite the allure of that, it seems to be fair and equitable, it may not always be a desirable thing to do. What if a TV costs $300 and Mr. Kim places a value of $200 on the TV and I place a value of $100 on the TV? If the agreement that Kim and I came to is that we would buy a TV if and only if the sum of our reservation prices it was greater than or equal to the cost of the TV, and we were both willing to pay half since we'd be splitting it, you can see that I would not be in favor of this because my half of the price of the TV is greater than my reservation price for a TV. So even though buying a TV would be a Pareto improvement, I would not be willing to do so. If you extend this logic a little bit farther, you can see where mischief can happen. What if the price of a TV were $300, but what if Mr. Kim and I both place enough value on the TV that either one of us would be willing to purchase the TV outright? But what if I lied and told Mr. Kim that my reservation price was $0? Mr. Kim would be willing to buy the TV all by himself, and then I get to use the TV, but I don't have to pay anything for it. So this would be really great, right? It would make me very well off. Well, this is an example of what economists call free riding. And if you think back to the game theory chapter, we introduced the idea of a dominant strategy equilibrium. I claim that free riding in a public goods provision game is a dominant strategy equilibrium. What that means literally is that me deliberately misrepresenting my value of the public good so I pay less makes me better off regardless of what the people I play against do. And that's what it means that free riding is a dominant strategy equilibrium. I'm always made better off by free riding regardless of what the other people I play against do. So as an illustration of this, consider a game in which Anne and Bruce so this is a laboratory game. Suppose that Anne and Bruce are given $10 of purchasing power, and they can choose any amount that they want, up to $10, that they contribute to a public good. And then the administrator of this game will take all the contributions to the public good, multiply it by 50%, and then split it equally between both players. So you can see that Anne and Bruce would maximize their joint payoff if they both contributed their $10 to the public good. So total public good contributions would now be $20. The administrator multiplies the donations by 50%. So the money pot now is $30, which are then split equally between Anne and Bruce. So Anne and Bruce could both get a payoff from the game of $15. So $15 is better than 10 if they kept their money and didn't contribute anything to the public good. But if we think about the incentive that each one of them has on the margin, you'll see why free riding is a dominant strategy equilibrium. Anne knows that regardless of what Bruce does, if she is thinking about whether to contribute an additional dollar to the public good, if she keeps that dollar, it increases her well-being by $1. If she contributes that $1 to the public good, the pot grows by $1. The administrator grows that by 50%, which is then split between both Anne and Bruce, so that Anne's payoff, if Anne gives one additional dollar to the public good, it increases her well-being by 75 cents. So Anne's incentive for each dollar is to basically keep it, right? Anne should not donate to the public good whether Bruce donates or not. And that's literally what it means to be a dominant strategy equilibrium. So in equilibrium, neither Anne nor Bruce should contribute anything to the provision of the public good. Okay. Now, so that's the discrete case. Now, if we think about where the public good is continuous, meaning we have to determine not whether we have the public good or not, but how much of the public good we should have, what we need to do is derive the market demand for the public good. So before we do that, let me review just a little bit from chapter 15, I believe it was, where we considered the market demand for a private good. So to compute the market demand for a private good, what we did is we added up the quantities that each consumer chose at every price. So what you can see here is I have from this diagram what amounts to horizontal addition. So at each given price, I add the quantities that consumers 1, 2, and 3 are willing to purchase, and that gives me the market demand. So where market demand intersects supply, and you recall that supply represented the marginal cost of production. So where the marginal cost of the last unit being produced is, that is set equal to demand for that unit. So demand represents one consumer's willingness to pay for that last unit consumed. When that value is equal to the cost of producing that unit of good, that determines both the market clearing price and the efficient quantity of the private good. Now, each individual consumer sees that market clearing price. So, since each consumer sees and responds to that market clearing price, what we can say then is in this market demand for private good, every consumer will have the same marginal rate of substitution between this good and money to spend on other goods and services, right? Because they see the market price and respond to it. What we could say, for instance, is that we all see the same price of gasoline, right? And we all choose the quantity of gasoline where our marginal rate of substitution is equal to the price of purchasing an additional gallon of gasoline. But we can all choose different quantities of gasoline to purchase. So, for example, I purchase very little gasoline because I drive a diesel car. Okay? So my consumption of gasoline is quite low. Now, individual consumers they may choose different quantities, but they all have to have the same marginal rate of substitution. For the efficient quantity of a public good, we have, in essence, something that's the mirror image of what we just derived. Since we have multiple people consuming the same unit of good at the same time, what we need to do is add up the value that each person has of consuming the last unit of the public good provided. So we, in essence, add up these values vertically. And then we have at the very bottom, what we could think of as the demand curve for the public good is the sum of the marginal rates of substitution. So it's how much value is provided by that unit of public good to all the people who are going to be consuming it. What we can say is that at the Pareto efficient quantity, the sum of the marginal rates of substitution must be equal to the marginal cost of providing that unit of good. Okay. So the marginal rate of substitution from review from way back when in the course, it's the partial of demand. It's the rate at which consumers are willing to trade the private good for units of the public good. So partial xi with respect to g, what that means literally is how many units of the private good would the consumer be willing to give up for one additional unit of the public good. So we sum those over all the people who are willing to consume. That must equal the marginal cost of providing an additional unit of output. So under this regime, every consumer will consume the same quantity of the public good. right? So we determine the efficient quantity. Everyone consumes the same quantity of the public good, but they might have different marginal rates of substitution, right? So some people may value the last unit of the public good provided more than other ones do. So if we think, for instance, about national defense, maybe some people value national defense far more than other people do. So people might place different values or have different marginal rates of substitution on the last unit of defense provided. So as an example of this, consider a Chinese New Year celebration that is done by the Baylor Economics Department. So there's about 20 economists in our department. And suppose that we all want to get together and celebrate the Chinese New Year and let every member of the department have a different utility function for minutes of fireworks and dollars to be spent on other goods. So we're going to index the different members of our department, I, from 1 to 20, and the utility of economist number I is equal to I times the log of G plus D sub I, where G is the number of minutes that the fireworks show lasts, and D sub I would be dollars that economist I has to spend on private goods for themselves. And suppose that fireworks cost $10 a minute. So what we need to do then is add the marginal rates of substitution over all 20 economists and set it equal to the marginal cost of providing an additional minute of fireworks. So when I take that partial derivative, so of course the marginal rate of substitution is defined by the ratio of the partial derivatives, as we learned from chapter 4. And then what I have is in the numerator, that partial derivative is I divided by G, where G is the length of the fireworks show. And in the denominator, the partial of utility with respect to dollars spent on other goods is equal to 1. So that sum must be equal to 10. We can factor 1 over G out, and we have 1 over G times the sum of the integers from 1 to 20 must be equal to 10. And there's a very well-known formula for the sum of integers. The sum of n integers is equal to n times n plus 1 over 2. I apply it in this case, and I get that the Baylor Econ Department Chinese New Year fireworks show should last 21 minutes. Okay. Now, the question is, how are we going to pay for this Chinese New Year celebration fireworks show? And one thing that you might think of is, what if the department chair announced that the cost will be divided in proportion to the utility function that each economist submits to our chair? So in other words, if I tell Professor Henderson that I really like fireworks, I'm going to get a big bill. But if I tell Professor Henderson that I don't like fireworks very much and I couldn't care less whether we have this or not, then I'll get a very small percentage of the bill. Well, if you think about our previous result about free riding being a dominant strategy equilibrium, it should be fairly obvious. Economists are very nasty, clever creatures. Each one of us has an incentive under this system to chronically underrepresent how much we value fireworks, because we don't want to have to pay for the show and that benefits everyone else. So one of the theoretical challenges to public economics, it was a big topic of debate several generations back. Can we come up with a mechanism that incentivizes people to tell the truth? How do we know how much they really know? How do we know how much they really like the public good if they know that if they say they like it, they're going to get a bigger tax bill? So the mechanism, one mechanism that was proposed to incentivize truth-telling is this result that Varian talks about in this chapter called the Vickrey-Clark-Groves mechanism. And it turns out that under this mechanism, truth-telling is a dominant strategy equilibrium, meaning that you can do no better than to tell the truth. And the way it works is that the tax bill, your tax bill for the fireworks show is changed only if your choice directly affects the outcome. So in other words, so if you think about why this should be a dominant strategy equilibrium, what would happen is if I underrepresent how much I value fireworks, that isn't going to reduce my tax bill. If I overrepresent how much I value fireworks, it will increase my tax bill only if my choice directly affects how long the fireworks program lasts. So what the Vickrey-Clark-Groves mechanism does is it has a weaker link between the value I state that I have for the public good and what my tax bill is. Okay. So as with many theoretically beautiful results, it does have problems. So it only works if there is no income effect, which you remember from earlier in the course. That is quasi-linear preferences, and that's a very specialized assumption. Also, the subjects can't collude. So if we were thinking back to the Econ Department Chinese New Year fireworks show, I can't collude with my friends to try to minimize our joint tax bill. That will ruin the Vickrey-Clark-Groves mechanism. And also, it turns out that this is not Pareto-optimal. And the reason why is that to incentivize truth-telling, tax revenues cannot be spent in a way to benefit anyone. So the tax revenues cannot go to directly funding the fireworks show to break this link between what I say and the benefit, how much I say I value fireworks, and then the length of the fireworks program. That link has to be broken to ensure that truth-telling is the dominant strategy equilibrium. So if the tax revenues can't be spent in a way to benefit anyone, what that means is the tax revenues have to be just dumped down some rat hole. And that is, if it doesn't benefit anyone, it's clearly not Pareto-optimal. So we've talked so far about what should be. So in other words, what are Pareto-optimal results? We've talked about whether a discrete public good should be provided or not. We've talked about for continuous public goods, what is the efficient quantity of the public good that should exist? The question is, does public economics have anything to say about what actually happens in the real world? I'm sure as cynical young college students, I won't break your hearts if I tell you that Washington, D.C. is not necessarily concerned with optimality, right? There aren't people in Congress that dutifully try to figure out who benefits by how much by public goods, right? These Pareto-optimal results that we've talked about before have nothing to do with what actually happens in Washington. But it turns out that the field of public economics does have one useful result that we can talk about, and it's the median voter theorem. So the theorem states that if preferences are single-peaked and choices can be ranked along a single dimension, then the most preferred choice of the median voter will win in a pairwise vote against any alternative. So probably the easiest way to illustrate the median voter theorem would be with an example. So what if we were trying to determine how many F-35 fighter jets to add to the Air Force budget? And there were three possibilities. There were no F-35s, so 0, some medium amount to be purchased, and then a high number. And suppose we have 3 representative members of the Senate. So we have first Bernie Sanders, independent socialist from Vermont, and suppose that Bernie thinks his most preferred outcome is that we buy no F-35s. His next preferred outcome is medium quantity, and his least preferred outcome is that we buy a whole bunch of F-35s. And then our more conservative senator in Texas, Ted Cruz, is of course the polar opposite of Bernie Sanders, and Ted thinks that we ought to have a whole bunch of F-35s, followed by medium, and the worst possible outcome is none at all. And then consider Susan Collins, who is a moderate Republican from Maine, and suppose that Senator Collins thinks a medium amount is most preferred, a high amount is next, and no F-35s is the least. So what the median voter theorem, so what we've shown here is that preferences can be organized or ranked along a single dimension. That's the number of F-35s produced. And you will notice that each one of these senators, when I plot out their choices along this single dimension, there's only one peak. So what the median voter theorem says is that Senate votes between a medium number of F-35s against any alternative, the most preferred choice of the median voter, which is Senator Collins, will win in a pairwise vote against any alternative. So medium versus high, Susan votes medium, Bernie votes medium, Ted votes high, so medium wins. Medium versus low, Susan votes medium, Ted votes medium, Bernie votes zero, so medium wins against zero. So that's the median voter theorem. Now, what does it mean to, just to expound a little bit more on single peak preferences? Consider Lindsey Graham, Republican of South Carolina, who has a reputation for being, what should we say, maybe a little bit of a dealer, kind of slippery. Okay? So what if Lindsey or Senator Graham thinks that we ought to have lots of F-35s? Actually, Senator Graham, by the way, was a member of the Air Force Reserve, so he likes the Air Force. So Senator Graham thinks we ought to have a whole bunch of F-35s, but if we can't have a lot of F-35s, we ought to have none at all. And the worst possible outcome is to have a small number of F-35s, because if you have a medium number of F-35s, you have elevated per unit costs, and you don't really have enough to be effective, so you're basically wasting money. You might as well have a whole bunch of them or none at all. So let this represent Senator Graham's preferences. So Lindsey is not single-peaked, so he violates the necessary conditions for the median voter theorem. So if you have people like Senator Graham with multi-peak preferences, then you might have cycling, and you can't guarantee that the most preferred outcome of the median voter would win in pairwise alternatives. Right? Okay, on to the quiz. Problem 1, we have the town of Muskrat, Ontario. Oops, I'm sorry, just north of Muskrat, Ontario. So Muskrat, Ontario is the setting for a problem in the intermediate micro workbook, as always. So now even farther north, we have Brass Monkey, which has 11,200 people. And so being in Ontario, the public good is a skating rink, and the private good are bottles of Labatt's ale. And suppose that Labatt's costs $1 per bottle. We're told that the skating rink costs $7 per square meter, and we have each citizen's utility function. So the only thing that's different by each citizen's utility function is their own private good. So each of them values the public good equally, which is a simplification over the Chinese New Year example that I just did in lecture. So the question is, what is the Pareto efficient size for the town skating rink? And what we would do is we need to add up the marginal rates of substitution over all the citizens. So we have 11,200 citizens. We add each citizen's marginal rate of substitution. We find that by the ratio of the partial derivatives, as always. And then the cost of an additional unit of the skating rink is basically how many bottles of Labatt's do we have to give up for each additional square meter of the skating rink, and that's 7. So the town has to give up 7 bottles of Labatt's to get an additional meter of the skating rink. So as I go through the math, what I find is that the efficient quantity of the skating rink is 320 square meters. And I got that by taking the partial derivatives, adding it over all the citizens, and solving for y. Okay. Then problem 2 is Bob and Ray, who are roommates, and they're thinking about buying a sofa. So this is very much like the problem of Mr. Kim and I trying to decide whether to buy a TV. So we have Bob's utility function, we have Ray's utility function. And we have income for each of them. And the question is, what is the most that Bob and Ray could spend on a sofa and it be a Pareto improvement? So what we need to do is find Bob's reservation price for the sofa and Ray's reservation price for the sofa. That's very straightforward. So we'll start with Bob on the left. What we know is that so I've repeated in the first line Bob's utility function. Bob's reservation price is the price that makes him indifferent between not having a sofa and spending his entire budget on other goods. And to the right of the equality, Bob's utility, if he has a sofa but contributed his top dollar, R sub B, to it. So we substitute in all the necessary parameters, the number of sofas, Bob's income that he can spend on other things, and we find Bob would be willing to kick in $600 to the sofa fund. And we do the same thing with Ray, right? We need to find Ray's reservation price. The reservation price for Ray is the one that makes him indifferent between not having a sofa or having a sofa. And when I go through the math in much the same way, Ray's reservation price is $400. So together, Bob and Ray could spend up to $1,000 on a couch and be made better off. Okay, so that does it for public goods.